people imagine this AI stuff is going to happen out there in the world. Like the concern is like, what's going to happen to the world and society? And those are legitimate concerns. But I think what's more interesting is how people who are using these technologies are transforming themselves as they're using them.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the reasons why I reached out with you is to talk through a little bit of this, because actually you were the first one that actually introduced me to Walter Ong and his work, and a lot of thinking about, you know, orality in pre-literate writing and all those kinds of things, which I just remember when I first was listening to your videos, like it just to try to put yourself into an observer, right, of someone who has no knowledge nor no horizon of language being written or stored in any kind of way, right, is just it's one of those, you know, kind of seeing the Ecker cube switch or something like that, like right in front of your eyes. It's so dramatically profound. Yeah. And I have a feeling, just to kind of catch you up a little bit. So if you remember, I started something called Circling a number of years ago. It basically emerged in the late 90s that I've been a part of. And it's essentially taking the basic I-thou unit of relation and making its various components in some sense a yoga, right? Like asanas of listening, such that people can kind of practice this kind of sense of intimacy, essentially. And it spread really, really fast. And for the longest time, I was trying to figure that out from kind of within what circling did and all this kind of stuff. And it took me a while to kind of wiggle free of that and start to realize that this all started right at the dawn of the internet. And that I think something really important happened. This is as far as my thinking has kind of gone with this, but I think something really important happened. Before the answering machine, you at least had to talk on the phone. You basically had to have that two-way exchange of communication, that back and forth. This two-way exchange connection was always coupled, as far as I can tell, with relation. Answering machine was this first time where you could kind of like leave messages back and forth, right, in some way, and then social media, and then now we have identities out there that are doing things right now that like we don't even have to be there for, right, in some sense. And then you end up with some of the stats that we have now, which is, you know, 80% of people report their lives feel like being meaningless. 50% of people report having no close friends. Yeah. Like the amount of time spent with family, right, and friendships is like reduced by like 60%. It's, I mean, the stats are astronomical. I think circling in some way that we weren't understanding at the time was a response, right, to that sense. In London, we have a minister of loneliness, right? I think it's its own breed of loneliness. Like, I think it's a different kind of loneliness, because normally when you think about loneliness, you think about like, I feel lonely, and that in some case lets me know, shit, I need to be more around people. And in some sense, it's a pain that motivates one to go be around people. But this seems to be a kind of loneliness that the more that you experience it, the more that you actually are less inclined to be around people. The more you're drawn into more isolation. So it's got this kind of reverse thing about it. And of course, all of this is within the last 20 years, right? So like, we don't know anything about it, right? But if you're really going to tell the history of this, which I think is basically Heidegger's notion of technology, right? Everything from the forgetfulness of being and all of that, I think is in synergy with this. You'd have to say, it seems to me that there's been these other collapsings in the structure of communication. And it's like, if I go all the way back and I think about, let's say, holy oral culture, right? Which here I am, I'm in a smaller pack of people, under 150 people, let's say, where everyone I know, right, I've known my whole life, and everyone that they've known their whole life, right? The influx of somebody outside of my particular pack, right, is probably a radical rarity and anomaly. And the sense of knowledge and the knower are completely fused, right? We're having to carry a certain kind of mythic history, these layers and layers of understanding that can't be stored anywhere. Pictures, of course, are not anything like alphabetic writing. And I'm trying to get this original sense of like, what must a conversation been like? What was relationships, right? What was it closer? Were they more intimate? And what way were they intimate? And I would imagine relationships had this significance to it that was implicitly so much denser in some way.
Yeah. The language was probably mostly transparent, and it was like an envelope of meaning, but no notion, of the language as an abstract system that stood independently of people. I mean, linguistics is actually quite a late development in scholarly, discovery. I mean, trying to study linguistics like rigorously as a science. Again, it's very modern. The Greeks, they said anyone who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian because they heard bar, just they heard a bunch of sounds. My guess is most people have thought very little about how much their consciousness has been radically remade in the image of literacy and the phonetic and the alphabetic word, and how much that sensibility of just being literate is very different. I mean, it changes your relationship to your own thinking. Like, I think anyone who uses a language at all, they give reasons, they think. But to become literate is to learn to reason about your reasoning. It's to have formal rules for logic. You get a growth of a massive amount of meta language. I mean, I think that was one of the real contributions of David Olson's work, is to talk about the rise of meta language. So I think all languages have to have some distinction between said and meant. That is, they have to be able to refer to the fact that they're talking. Now, again, you could ask, for how long were people talking before they had a word for what they were doing? Were they just, engaged in meaning, and then later there's like this meta language of called, the word like language that somehow is a system that's independent of the meanings that are conveyed. There's so many words that are obviously meta language, a word like documentation, or a word like library, or a word like alphabet, but even subtler words, like reason or evidence or hint, or a word like paraphrase. The paraphrase verbatim distinction, I think, is one of the legacies that was clearly documented by people like Milman Berry, who they tried to show that, the oral mind, it has some notion of the same expression, but it doesn't have a notion of a verbatim recounting. So like these singers of oral tales, they do these oral histories and have these very elaborate mnemonic devices for recalling great amounts of information. And they certainly do have incredible memories. But when they took tape recorders over to some of these places where the oral bards were and they recorded them, they'd find slight little variations here and there that, for the speaker, who the words are largely transparent and the meaning is coming through, they're, like I said, the same thing. But the literate sensibility is like, no, you said a different expression. Again, we're gonna bust out with some meta language to differentiate out what was said, strictly speaking, from what was meant. One of the great examples that Olson gives is like children, pre-literate children, they attend to the meaning of the words rather than the words. And one of his examples is he'd walk up to, again, very young children, like age 3 or so, and say, give me an example of a tiny word and then a really long word. And he'd say, how about caterpillar? And the kids would go, oh, caterpillar. No, caterpillars, that's a little tiny thing. And then he'd say, how about train? And they would go, oh, no, train. Train's a really big word. And that is, they would think about the object that's being meant by the word, not the properties of that word itself.
Yeah, totally. To be able to offload and to not have to hold up in memory, right? This whole thing.
It releases that burden of the fear of forgetfulness, and then you get a rise in novel expressions and experimentation. To think novel thoughts and unexpressed thoughts, to not just traffic in cliche, was to risk forgetfulness of lessons learned. And so there really is a direct sense in which the explosion of information and creative thought does run hand in hand with forms of literacy, documentation.
Totally.
I don't have a pen in my hand right now. I don't know if you have a pen, but this doesn't look at the surface like a literate event, but this is a highly literate conversation. I mean, we're dropping names about certain authors, we're talking about literate tradition, but it's like the syntax and the grammar, the way that we're thinking, we're making sort of speculative, hypothetical thoughts, and I'm like trying to imagine a somewhat unknown listener who I'm not really sharing a background with. Like, in some sense, I'm talking to you, but I'm also aware that this is recorded. So I'm trying to speak to people who I know are not here in this context. That's very different than the oral mind. I mean, the oral mind is a particular speaker to a particular person at a particular occasion with some exigency that's calling for address. That's very different than texts that just kind of wander around. And then they introduce, again, as you mentioned, this notion of knowledge just abstractly out there, or of what information is in the abstract and how it would be consumed in a different context by a different person with a different set of assumptions. Dealing with something like ambiguity of the possible message because of different audiences that I know are going to hear it. That's again a sensibility I think would just be unheard of for a wholly oral mind or a wholly oral situation.
Oh, interesting. Totally. Now, there's also this other part where I wanted to talk with you too about this. It seems to me that literacy doesn't it afford the abstracting of the thinking of yourself independent of context, right? This kind of thing that Descartes does on steroids. If I remember right, Ong talks about people who are illiterate have a very difficult time talking about themselves in the abstract, right? They usually they can talk about themselves in the context of telling a story, right? Or undergoing something or something like that. But to ask you well, who are you really? These things that draw out, right? That didn't really become possible until literacy. Am I right?
I think that's very right. There's a lot. I think David Olson, Eric Havelock, Ong, Ivan Illich, Jack Goody, Elizabeth Eisenstein. The printing press hasn't even changed. There's just so much on this that there is a kind of hypothetical thought. When Luria did his study with illiterate peasants in Russia, he went up there and he would say something like this. He would say to the people, he would say, so in the north where this particular person lives, there are only white bears. And they would go, okay. And he goes, okay, so you go up to the north and you see a bear. What color is it? And they would go, I don't know. I didn't see the bear. And they would go, well, what color is it? And they would be like, I don't know. There's lots of different color bears in different places. And immediately concluded that these were illiterate people who were somehow illogical and unable to make inferences and think rationally. And other people went, no. This has to do with genre of utterance. And the person who was posing the question was, again, you need the meta language. The person who was posing the question was imagining that these were logical conjectures that were rigorously sound and could be deduced the right answer from, whereas to the people who were actually hearing them, they were going, this is just hearsay. I don't have to like follow what you're claiming is some necessary truth and some logical deduction that could be entailed. You're just making noise, you know? So I think, you know, that trying to understand the genre of the utterance, you know, that ability, like I think we're so used to testing and formal schooling that we've learned to think very abstractly about information, and we look down at tests and we go, oh look, you know, they're asking something about information generally, whereas the holy moral mind, I don't know if it has that kind of rigorous meta language to differentiate like what potentially could be going on. Instead, it just kind of goes from its own experience and is like, well, that's not my experience. I'm next. You know, they don't really have that concern about how it's supposed to be understood in the abstract.
Doesn't have that horizon, of
like a smooth and right answer. The oral world is much more antagonistic. It has that, it's an agon. You have this like different forces come together. One says this, one says no, one says that, and there's this contestation, whereas the kind of cool detachment that comes from entertaining a thought without being animated by it, literacy really funds that. It allows, as McLuhan says, you know, literacy made surgery possible. It makes possible this ability to act without reacting. When the Flint water crisis happened here in Michigan, there was a woman who was given testimony about what had happened to her family and her children. And I mean, she was obviously very upset. And when she got up to give her testimony, she pulled out her statement and she basically read it and was biting back tears while she was reading the statement. In some way you could go, well, of course she's going to read the statement, but there's another sense in which, like, if she wouldn't have had the ability to write it down and read it, she would have started to react to her own reaction and the whole thing would have just fell apart. And so she was able to get a hold of herself and like keep her composure amidst an obviously very emotionally riling time. You know, it's really interesting to look at number of people who are in prison who have dyslexia. And what I mean, if you enter the society and then you're taken to not read, and then you're taken to be like somebody who has like some mental deficit because you can't read or you have reading difficulties, then illiteracy rates come in, and as you get to illiteracy rates, you get to sort of different orientations to your emotions, and again, all kinds of opportunities start to fall out, and people get, you know, they end up in the prison system. It's really, it's quite scary how much illiteracy rates run with gang memberships, run with forms of like domestic violence. You know, there's a lot of ways in which becoming literate kind of changes your overall relation to yourself, your own thoughts, your own emotional life. But I mean, I think where we were going just about 10 or 15 minutes ago with this question about the spike of loneliness or the forms of alienation, I mean, I'd like to see if we could, you know, if time permits, I would like to make sure we get back to some of that.
Yeah, totally. When you talked about like this kind of oral culture is like this kind of antagonism, another way of talking about it is contact. Right? This kind of sense of contact.
Yeah.
Whereas in that video on Facebook, right, you were talking about, you know, you have this break and you lose connection, as you said, with the kind of ongoing sensations of being a body, right? And you become an other for others, where now I can have an icon of myself, right? And go out there and get its reflection that then I reflect upon, right? Like, I don't even know, once we get into that, I'm like, I don't even know what words to use or how to think about it exactly.
Yeah, we're different people in different relationships with different others, and we discover a lot about ourselves depending upon the different others that we're currently in connection with. Each person is unique to me in my relationship. But then when you get these kind of online, I'm going to post something on Facebook just anonymously, generally, there is a kind of homogenizing of self. Like, I increasingly have some abstract notion of myself as it is context-free, as it is independent of all these particular kinds of relations. And that itself is, it's probably, you know, it's some sign of stability, but it's another kind of radical estrangement. I mean, it's like this multi-layered thing that I think you're sort of hinting at. Herd animals and flock animals don't really bear self-awareness the way we do. So they probably feel loneliness, but only when they're away from the herd. We are social animals, but we also have these deep, interiority, the sense of inward representation, the sense of my own past, my own possibilities of future, my own unique characteristics and qualities. And so what that means is that I can feel lonely in a crowd. So there's two kinds of loneliness. They go in different directions. One in when I feel like I'm not really had enough time with other people, but then there's other times when I haven't had enough time with myself. And so again, when you were talking about these kinds of alone experiences that are like positive feedback loops that lead more into it. When we were talking about this difference between antagonistic and or these cool and detached, one of the ways to come at it is to say, what are the differences when you want to talk with someone between having a face-to-face or a phone conversation versus a texting? And I think, a lot of students, for many things, now it depends on what it is, but for many things, they kind of prefer texting because they get a chance to, in a detached way, think and really, carefully wordsmith what they're going to say. They sometimes feel like performance anxiety to have to come up and formulate thoughts on the fly, and they're going to say something they regret, or there's all these kinds of different ways in which you can feel the antagonistic nature of everyday speech, because it is, it has that live time interactive. My wife and I, we do a lot of papers and we exchange papers for feedback. But we've learned over the years to never give the feedback verbally. It gets me very irritated. It's so much easier to write it on paper and go, here's my suggestions for your revisions. But if I start and go, if I'm going to point it out verbally, piece by piece, or she's going to do it to me, we get very irritated and be like, just write it down and I'll think about it.
Right. But in a pre-literate society, a relation, just even the sense of having a face is completely different. It's we're in some sense in the narcissistic reflection, you're always thinking about how I look, right? Essentially my face. But in some kind of an oral culture, my face, I've never seen it, right? In fact, it's it seems like my face is for everyone else. They paint it and all that kind of stuff, right? I don't even have a sense of some kind of me in the modern sense of the word that I've seen the mere image of, that then I can then kind of inform my trying to get reified by you in some sense.
I think that's exactly right. In oral societies, other people decorate your face, and your identity is one that's part of the tribe, so it's never in question. Whereas we know of life off the rack. One of the best books on this, just absolutely fascinating, is Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me by Edmund Carpenter, who was a colleague of McLuhan. This was in the late 60s, 67. He was commissioned by the government of New Guinea to go and to try to end these warring tribes that were having, vengeance, killings, and cannibalism, and all kinds of crazy stuff going on in Pawpaw. And he went there and he took all these modern communication technologies, cameras and video recorders and tape recorders and chessboards and mirrors, and sort of introduced a lot of these different tribes to these technologies. And it's the discovery of self, the recognition of a self as a separate thing from the tribe. We documented it in countless ways. They would take a picture and then they would show people the photo. And they didn't even know what to make of it. They're like, what is this? And they'd point to the nose, then they'd touch them on the nose, and suddenly the people would have this shock of they just captured me, somewhere on there. A different way to say all this, and maybe to echo what you were saying, is there's a group photo and you're in the group photo. Who's the first person you look at? Yourself. Yeah. And it's, you know what everyone else looks like, but you don't know what you look like. And even as you're looking at the photo, you're going, but what do other people see when they see that? Kind of wondering what other people see when they see our face. And that's, I think there is a sort of there's a profound discovery of who one really is there, that we are really thoroughly in relationship. We're not just this self self-standing autonomous thing. I would say money and literacy. It is certainly the calendar, the clock, it's the mirror, it's lit, but money and literacy, those are the two main legs that the self-standing autonomous individual, like the notion of a person who is fully, quotes, on their own. All you need is literacy and money, and you're on your own, baby. I mean, you're making your own decisions, you're calling the shots, you're legally responsible, you're doing all this kind of stuff.
It's like this kind of notion of identity is this thing that you have, right? Like, and you make decisions about, right? And you decide on, like, identity politics and stuff like that. And John was saying from, a 4E cognitive science, which of course is influenced by Dreyfus and Heidegger and all that stuff, right? Where he's like, no, you have agency such that you become an identity, such that you become identifiable by others. You develop character, right? Such that you can, it's in some sense so that you are perceivable by other characters, right? There's kind of this notion that it's like, it's not just subjective and it's not just intersubjective, right? It's kind of transjective in some sense, right? And it sounds like in Holy or Culture, that sense of like my character, my agency, who I am, in some sense is like for you.
And it was caught within seasonal rhythms, and the world made calls upon you in a way that we've learned how to detach ourselves from particular geographies, from particular rhythms of the day and the year. And people really do have a kind of radically technologically created individual autonomy of them going about their day and deciding which restaurant to go to have cook their meal, all this kind of stuff. It's hard to put it in adequate perspective.
I have a feeling at some point we're going to have to reckon with, now that we're going to have a generation that like doesn't have a memory before the internet and raised on screens, we're going to be finding out what that grand experiment was, right? And may have to come to reckoning with it. Embodied relation, the back and forth. It seems like that tension, like, is this, I think it's how we become people.